Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's been a long 2 days already. Lori's put the pressure on me, I realize, building me up, so this is a lot to we'll see how I react under pressure. And in addition, I'm the last speaker, and we're talking about federal grants and procurement. So I'd say this is a real test for me, I guess. So hopefully you will gain something from this. I said before, I'd never seen myself in this position before. I don't know if you were involved. Were any of you involved in the S&P audits? Anybody? The S&P audits were nothing but a chaotic, we need to get this done, here's the deadline, no ifs, ands, or buts, you will have it done by this time. Luckily, most of the officials were great about helping us. We were working weekends. I had a fairly new person, and things were going along just fine until November of the 27th. And on that day, I received an email from Paul Joyce. Now, we all know who Paul Joyce is, the tall. He's scary, but he's not ugly. That was Dean that said that, if you're listening, Paul. So Paul emails me one day and asked me to call him immediately on his cell phone, personal cell phone, which never happens. I had to read it twice to make sure I understood what he was saying. So, not really knowing what he was going to say, I actually went out to my car and said, "Yes, what can I do for you today?" Of course. He proceeded to tell me that afternoon, this was about 9:30 in the morning, that afternoon he was to speak at the accounting club at Ball State University. And the individual that was supposed to join him had a death in the family and was unable to attend. And he asked me if I could come and join him. Obviously, I'm going to say yes. And I said, "Sure, what time?" And so I'm just there for moral support, or what is it you want from me? He said, "No, I want you to give a presentation." I said, "It's 9:30. What am I going to talk about?" And, well, I'm going to leave that up to you. So I sat there for a few minutes. I honestly was a little freaked out to begin with. And so I thought, and I ended up just talking about what I know best. So we arrive at the Ball State at the accounting club, and it was great. Pizzas were brought in, and I thought, well, if nothing else, pizzas will keep them there. And so Paul started the presentation. Of course, he had the slideshows. He'd done the same presentation I don't know how many times. And then he introduced me, and I probably am, like what I am right now, a little bit nervous, anxious, but excited. So what I decided to do was actually just talk about the special investigations that I had been on in Delaware County and in surrounding counties. That really caught their attention. I was real pleased the way it went. I gave them a lot of detail. Accounting students like those kind of things. It's interesting to see how people are stealing, how we found it. And so I was on a roll, and Paul says, "Okay, I think that's enough." Well, I'm just now getting started. And either that, or it's because I was between the pizza and the door and they couldn't leave. So anyway, the presentation went well. And basically when we left, Paul asked me if I would be interested in this job. So I look back and I wonder if that just wasn't my interview, which was a heck of an interview. But anyway, that's how I got here. Before that day, I would have never considered being a director. I'm excited to be here. I live in Jay County. Finally, we have the opportunity for those that don't live in Indy to participate. And so I appreciate the board giving me that opportunity, but basically, that's how I ended up here. Before November 27th, I would still be in special investigations, but it's good to be here. So today, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about federal grants. And from what I understand, Lori was talking about the CAPs, the corrective action plans, and just some discussing with some officials, I think there's some confusion on exactly how to complete information on the federal grants. So what we're going to talk about today is some general information. There are various forms of federal grants, and how those grants are received. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about who should be approving the grant agreements, establishing funds, the budgeting process, and the CFA, which is your grant schedule. And finally, I'm going to give you some tidbits about auditing your federal grants. So, federal money can come in a variety of ways, and most of these you probably know. Direct grants from federal agencies. That would be money coming directly from the federal government. Some Department of Justice grants come directly to local units versus passing through a state. The second item, amounts passed through the state. That's what most of you are receiving. Your federal money will flow through the state agency and then to the local unit. Good examples of these would be grants from the Department of Transportation being sent to NDOT, being sent to you. So that, like I said, there are several, but that is a common one. Program income, which program income is just extra money that's generated from grant monies. And receipt of donated property. We're talking about surplus, federal surplus. And the last one, which probably isn't too common, would be loans, which are interest-free or guaranteed loans. Commodities, food commodities, which you'll see in schools, school lunch. So anyway, these are the various forms of grants that you may receive. Like I said before, the pass-through grant, federal grant to state to local. But there's also a chance you could see federal, state, local, local. So a good example of that would be the Department of Justice, the Operation Pullover Grant. I've seen those funds come from the federal to the local units. Even I've seen the one I'm particularly talking about is money that actually came from the federal government to the city of Muncie to Delaware County. So you can also have a pass-through that is not the state agency. Most of them are, but there are those programs that they may run through another local unit. This is really important because you need to know what these are when you're completing your grant information in Gateway. The types of federal grants. Advance grant. Grant monies received before the disbursements are made. You're probably familiar with child support incentive. You actually are using those grant monies to make the expenditures. Most of what you have are going to be reimbursement grants. This is a disbursement made from your local fund, and then you claim reimbursement with federal funds, and then which is what most of you have. The grant process, I know, varies in each county, but in general, this is the way it should go. A department head will go and request a grant from the county commissioners to actually apply for the grant. The grant application should be signed by the commissioners and remitted to the federal agency or the pass-through agency for approval, whichever is they are dealing with. The federal agency or the pass-through agency, they're going to review the grant application, and they're either going to approve it or they're going to deny it. If they approve it, you're going to receive a grant award letter. This is probably one of the most important documents you're going to receive, the grant award letter. You're going to use this as much as we're going to use this. Your award letter is going to give your recipient name, which would be you, ID numbers, period of performance, and all these will make sense later on. CFDA number. I know you all know what, you've heard that term. CFDA number. That's a really important one to get from that grant agreement. So a grant agreement, it sets the terms and conditions of what the purpose of the grant is. So the county does not need to establish a grant fund, do not need to establish a home rule ordinance for a new grant. You just create the grant fund and no home rule is required. Every grant needs its own individual fund, 99% of the time. We can't stress that enough. Because when you go to Complete Gateway, you've got to have just those federal dollars, receipts, and disbursements, and it's much easier to pull those when they are in their own fund. And obviously, the county auditor will assign the fund number. For federal funds, you'll use the 8100 series. In addition to having individual funds, it's going to show that you're in compliance with some of the items we're going to test, for example, reporting. You report your disbursements, receipts, and that type of thing. That's great audit evidence of, that support your receipts, or excuse me, the reports that you submit. So this is so important. One of the last audits I've done in the field, they actually had one fund for all their grants, and it was a large city. And I finally said, you've got to stop right now, new fund, because they could not identify, even the ending balance, which grant it went with. So it's really important to those separate funds. And I was really surprised a large city like that, but. The other thing I want to mention, if you have a separate fund, and I don't know that some do this, and we'll talk a little bit about the budgeting process, but it's so important, especially on advanced grants. You know, you're going to get your approved grant. It's going to give you a budget. And what you should do is set up your appropriations based on that budget exactly. Then when you go to file the reports, everything coincides with what the report says. So when you get to Gateway, it's really important to enter this information correctly because that's going to depend on what Board of Accounts, what kind of engagement you're going to have. So I have copies of the actual grant schedule in Gateway, which it didn't kind of flow like I wanted. So I'm just going to these are the headings that you will be dealing with when you go in to enter information into Gateway. The one thing that was very helpful to me, and I'm basically going to talk about the user guide. There's a little icon at the top almost every screen you're on that says user guide. I didn't even realize it was pretty neat. You go down and hit, I think it's like federal fund or grant fund, and all this information, every one of those attributes, they detail out what you need to do. So all I'm doing is kind of summarizing what really you already have access to. So the local project name, you're going to use the name that you refer to it locally. Not the exact name on the grant award, but what you refer to it as. The federal program and the federal agency, a lot of these, they're going to come from the grant award letter. The Gateway actually has a listing of all the federal agencies and their number. Each number represents a specific agency. So if you don't know what the federal agency is, but you know the CFDA number, there's a way that you can find that. So again, the user guide is very helpful with little hints like that. Pass-through agency, we talked about what that would be. That would be the entity, the state, or most likely state, that the monies have flown through. CFDA number, that identifies the grant program. Again, the grant award letter. We've had some issues where state grants have shown up on the grant schedule. It's very easy to do. I would think number one rule is, do they have a CFDA number? Your pass-through agency should know that. The federal agency should know that. That's going to indicate whether it's federal or state. There are very few that don't have one, but 99% have a CFDA number. So that is your best method in identifying federal grants versus state. Again, we'll go this quickly. Award name and award number, these are obviously things that will be on the grant award letter. The grant type, this is where I really want to stress. It's so important to put the type of grant, whether it's advance or reimbursement. I'm going to repeat that one more time because this is your grant schedule. It is so important that you know whether you have an advance grant or reimbursement grant. I don't want to confuse you, but if you have an advance grant, after you enter your receipts and disbursements, we're going to pull your disbursements for your grant schedule. If you have a reimbursement grant, your CFA or your grant schedule is going to be the receipts. And the reason we do that is we look at the federal agency has actually approved this expenditure. So you see why it's so important to know whether you have an advance or a reimbursement, because that sets the tone for everything we're going to audit. Fund number, you know that fund name. Again, the receipts. There's a short picture of what part of the grant information looks like. The disbursements, again, we talked about having separate funds. That makes it very simple to pull receipts and disbursements. I think we even ask for fund numbers, so we're encouraging those individual grants. Federal awards provided to subrecipients. There may be some monies that you actually pass through to subrecipients. If that's the case, that's where you note the amount of disbursements to those subrecipients. We've gotten federal non-cash assistance and insurance, which isn't as common. So we come in to do your audit. Basically, and you're probably all aware of this, from the gateway, we're going to run your financial statements, and we're going to run your CFA, Schedule of Federal Expenditures. And again, it's going to be totally based on how you answered those questions. That's going to determine whether you've got an audit or you do not audit of federal funds. So we're going to look at the CFA. It's our responsibility. We have to state whether the CFA, we'll go on, never mind. The other thing we're going to do is test your controls. And what that is, and we'll talk more about it when we get into procurement, but for example, let's say we're looking at the disbursement process for a particular grant fund. So the first thing we'll do is actually identify what the controls are. The department head orders the goods, the invoice comes in, he states that they've been received, the invoice then goes to this individual, and then the commissioners approve. You see what I'm saying? We identify what all the controls are, and then we're going to test those controls over whatever grant that we determine is a major program. And finally, we're going to do compliance testing. Like, in other words, we're going to look at the federal report. Is the report in compliance? Is it correct? And the compliance part at that point has nothing to do with internal controls, and Lori hit on that somewhat. So that was one of the questions. They want to know, what do you audit for? Right here it is. There's a lot more to it than just 3 items, but that's basically what it is. If you understand how to do the CFA, hopefully things will go from there okay. Keep in mind that we're going to look at probably every grant on your CFA. So anything, this is just a good rule of thumb, anything you enter in that, whether it be a CFDA number, grant or whatever, have supporting documentation. So just kind of look at it that way. Anything I enter, I need to be able to show where I pulled that information. I love to see a grant file in an auditor's office or a controller's office. I've always told them, tell your department heads that if they don't want to see me, then they should bring this information to you. So if you want to make your auditors happy, you should have a grant file for every grant you have. And some of the things in the grant file, grant application, which we talked about that early in the process, the grant award letters, most importantly right there, grant award letters, that's all your information basically on your CFA is from your grant award letter. The claim vouchers, you send in reimbursements, you'll have your vouchers, attach your invoices. Again, I'm giving you what I would like to see. You're going to have, obviously, different examiners, but requests for advances, anything supporting the receipts coming in, submitted reports, if they do quarterly reports, special reporting, any type of report with the supporting documentation attached. There's been a lot of times you'll go in and you'll ask for the federal report. They have no idea where the numbers came from. So that's a great thing to keep in mind, even the special reports that are non-financial. Put supporting documentation, because if it's a major program, we're going to ask for it. It'd be nice just to get one grant file. And I'm asking a lot, I know that, and that is a utopia society, I realize, but it can happen because I've seen it, I've trained it, I've audited the same unit several years in a row, and it works. And it doesn't take much to convince your department heads when we start calling them. So the other thing to remember, if you hire a consultant, you're still responsible for the grant information. Because that is not a control, just the fact that you have a grant, you've hired a grant consultant. So you still need to be involved in the process. So when we go into to do a federal audit, again, from your CFA, we're going to generate the major programs we're going to audit. And those are, I know you've all seen them. You know they're the large ones. We're going to come in, and we've actually got something we get from the federal government that tells us what to look at. And these are the different categories that we're looking at. The first one, activities allowed or unallowed. What they're saying is that is the big picture. Is that grant disbursement eligible? Is that disbursement an eligible grant expenditure? The allowable cost principles. Do you have supporting documentation to support this disbursement? We're going to probably most likely pull a sample of the disbursements from the fund, and we're looking to see if they're allowable, if they're properly supported, invoices, contracts, whatever. Cash management. Was the disbursement expended before you submitted a claim for reimbursement, if it's a reimbursable type? Eligibility. You're going to determine whether eligibility determinations were made. For that particular program. Equipment and real property. This applies on a grant-by-grant basis. We're going to determine that you maintain proper records of your equipment. If you're using federal money to purchase equipment, that needs to be in your capital asset records. You actually need to note purchase with federal money. So those need to easily be identified in the capital asset records. Subrecipient monitoring. Again, you're responsible to monitor your own subrecipients. There should be subrecipient agreements. Are you following up? Not all grants have this, but they are out there, and we're looking for detailed information. And hopefully, you're going to get enough grant information, and even in especially your grant agreement, to give you guidance on these things. And finally, special tests and provisions. These are compliance requirements that are different in every grant. This is something that would be special to that particular grant. And that obviously varies on a grant-by-grant basis. So these controls here, what we're going to do, and we just talked about that, we're going to come in and we're going to document your controls. Remember what I said? So-and-so, department head orders the goods, how the invoice flows. We're going to document those controls, and then we're going to test them. Okay, you said the department head approves the invoice or the claim, or this is what you told us happened. We're going to pull a sample and we're going to say, okay, now we're going to test the controls from this is what they said happened. Did it really happen? We're also going to test in compliance, like we talked about before. Was this an allowable disbursement? Yes or no? Nothing to do with internal controls. So, CFA, we're going to test your controls. We're going to do compliance testing on your major programs, those last two. So, the State Board of Accounts, this is our reporting requirements, which Lori hit somewhat. On the CFA, which is your grant schedule, we are to put an opinion on the CFA to state if the statement is fairly presented in relation to the financial statements taken as a whole. So basically, we're going to say whether they're fairly presented or they're not. Again, individual funds, you can't go wrong. Individual funds and advance versus reimbursement, and you've got it. The test of controls. Like she said before, we don't express an opinion on those. We're required to disclose if there are certain deficiencies. But the test of controls, we could have issues when compliance testing is okay. Like she said, there may not be controls in place, but the report is correct even though there are no controls in place. If you have an instance like that, like she said, like Lori mentioned, either you have no controls in place or the controls you have in place are not effective. Either way. So 99% of the time, if you have a compliance finding, it's an automatic internal control. Does that make sense? Even though you go and you have those controls and we identified them, if we test those, we may even test and see that it works out fine and get to the compliance and realize things were not in compliance. And in that case, we can say the controls were inefficient. They were in place but inefficient. So I want you to know what the difference is. You can't just establish it. We're going to test, so make sure that you comply with what you come up with. On compliance testing, we're going to express an opinion on the compliance of the major program that we audit based on the compliance requirements, like we just talked about, activities allowed, unallowed, subrecipient monitoring. And that's just information we get from the federal government that tells us exactly what we're testing. Because we honestly we audit grants from child nutrition to child support enforcement. I mean, we're definitely not experts in all that. So, the budget requirements. There's always some confusion on whether grants need to be budgeted or not. Advance grants, no appropriation is required because generally you're going to have an itemized grant budget. Like we talked about before, take that grant budget and set up those appropriation line items. You can't get much better audit evidence than that. So no, advance grants are not required to be budgeted. Reimbursement grants, basically the disbursement of county funds require an appropriation. So when the reimbursement is received, it needs to be appropriated. So there's a little difference there between the two. And the last thing, as far as the reimbursement grants, you are not required to go through the additional appropriation process with the LGF on the reimbursement grants. I just wanted to follow that up with the budgeting process. So are there any questions? Okay. So one of the things I did want to point out, I'm obviously the newbie because every one of my PowerPoints, they're different. It's just like whatever, I like purple or I use this one until I realized State Board of Accounts actually has templates. So this will probably be the last time I get to use my purples and all that. Also, I thought it was kind of nice. printed and put those on the website in color. I know that cost a little extra money. So again, always learning. But I'm not embarrassed to admit. And there's been a lot of things I've came up with that we've decided we need new policies on. So it's not coming up. Oh, don't do that. Nothing like little technical difficulties to put you even more under pressure, is it? All right, we're going to finish the day off with something riveting. Procurement, purchasing with federal grants. But there are a lot of changes in this that we felt like we really wanted to stress some things. Federal grants, effective July 1st, 2016, the Code of Federal Regulations came out with the Uniform Administrative Requirements and Cost Principles. There's a long, long title there. And within those standards are the procurement standards. And all those standards are under 200.317 to 326. What I have done, I struggled with this on a good way to present this, but this is almost a little handbook for you to quite actually share it with others, or just to have so you know where to look for the information you need. So we're going to go through each of these standards, some of them quite quickly because they really don't apply, but those that have an asterisk I think would be important to you, and we'll spend a little more time on those areas. So I won't really read them. You can read. We got 317, procurement by state, general procurements, competition, and so on. I wanted to list these out because when you do get into the procurement stage, this is going to be a great reference for you to go to know which CFR that you need to go to for more detail. The first one, 200.317, is pretty easy. The states basically have to follow the same policies that they use for non-federal funds. But unfortunately, yours is not even close to being that easy. This is an asterisk. If I see an asterisk, I'm going to say this is an asterisk, just because some of these are going to affect you and no other office. The unit, a non-federal entity, must use their own documented procurement procedures which reflect applicable state, local laws, and regulations. So you're going to have your own procurement policy, again, that addresses state and local laws that you follow. Even though you know you've always been following them, they're going to have to be put in a written document. A lot of these, as we go through, are common sense, but I put them in here anyway since I was doing a summary of all of them. You need to maintain oversight to ensure contractors perform in accordance with contracts. Let's hope most of them are doing that already. Your written procurement standards need to cover conflict of interest and govern the action of employees engaged in the selection, award, and administration of the contracts. Those three verbs right there: selection, award, administration. You cannot have an employee, agent, or office holder who has a conflict of interest who can participate in these items. And they gave a definition of conflict of interest. It would arise when the employee, officer, or agent, member of his or her immediate family, his or her partner, or an organization which employs or is about to employ any of the parties indicated herein has a financial or other interest, and personal benefit to gain from the contract. This is one we really wanted to stress. The third one, no employee, officer, or agent may neither solicit nor accept gratuities, favors, or anything of monetary value from contractors or parties to subcontractors. Now, there are exceptions to that. You may set standards for situations that financial interest would not be substantial or would be a nominal value. But those standards have to be set to be able to accept anything. In addition, your procurement procedure needs to state the disciplinary action for anyone who violates the conflict of interest. Again, common sense, avoid acquisition and unnecessary or duplicate items. Consideration should be given to consolidating or breaking out procurement to obtain a more economical purchase. I want to stress here that does not mean we're breaking down a project to avoid the bid process. That's not what they're saying here. For instance, it would be maybe, should we lease or should we purchase this asset? They're also encouraging that you enter into state and local intergovernmental agreements to try to save money for procurement or shared goods and services. And they're encouraging the non-federal entities to use surplus property in lieu of buying new equipment. I know there are some law enforcement agencies that have obtained some surplus property. Again, these won't obviously pertain to you, but they talk about using value engineering clauses, must award contracts only to responsible contractors possessing the ability to perform successfully, and so on. Here they're referring to suspension and debarment, which is always confusing. It's always confusing to know when to determine if a contractor is suspended or debarred, so I actually pulled up some of the standards. Basically, all non-procurement purchases have to have, the vendors need to be checked for suspension and debarment. And some of those non-procurement transactions would be like grants, scholarships, fellowships, cooperative agreements. In addition to the non-procurement transactions, procurement transactions in excess of $25,000, you need to do this. A good rule of thumb may be just to do it on all of it, but I wanted to at least tell you what the regulations say. So non-procurement and procurement of items over $25,000. Last one, organizations must maintain records sufficient to document the rationale, method of procurement, and so on. We go into time and materials can only be used after other item or contracts have been looked at. You're responsible for good and administrative practices, sound business, and so on. Now we're in competition. This is a heavy one that they're really focusing on. All procurements must be conducted in a manner that provides full and open competition. So they actually give examples in the Code of Federal Regulations, and some of the placing unreasonable qualifying requirements would include like requiring unnecessary experience or non-compliance contracts that are for consultants who are on retainer. If you use that specific brand name and it really limits competition, these are the things they're actually disclose in the regs. And you need to conduct in a manner that prohibits the use of statutorily or administrative imposed or geographical preferences. We all know some people have those local contractors they just always like to use. This is saying you can't do that. They can be on your list. They can be part of the process, but you are not allowed just to go with those local vendors without following the proper process. Now, there are going to be times when there might be state regulations, for example, like an engineer that needs a state license and something like that. That's different. The written procedures, this is what really pertains to the counties. You need a clear and accurate description of the technical requirements for material, product, or services. And it talks about you have to talk about competition, that you can't restrict competition, detailed product specs, can't use that brand name. I'm going over these quickly, but at the end of the presentation, I'm going to have you pull out a piece of paper and kind of hit those top things, because we've discussed a lot on what you need to consider putting in writing. Okay, because it's all throughout the regulations. I kind of had to go through and find them here and there, but hopefully I can at least give you a good start with your procurement policy. So a lot of places will have an actual list, a pre-qualified list of persons that they will choose from. Make sure that they're current and they are qualified. You can't preclude bidders from bidding during this process. Even if you have a bid list, if you have a pre-qualified list, if someone wants to bid on a project, they should be allowed to do that. Here is another very important section. This is on procurement methods. This is going to tell you when you've got to have a quote, bid, and so on. The first one, micro purchases. 328 deals with your small purchases. So if you have a purchase with federal funds of $3,000 or less, you do not have to, there's no bids required. However, you need to distribute that business equitably among the qualified suppliers. That's basically all the guidance they give. Micro purchases, they can be rewarded again without taking quotes if they consider that the price is reasonable what they're going to pay. So this is the one that we do not require. They do not require competition or quotes. We're still under the different procurement methods. 320 still, we have small purchases below the simplified acquisition threshold. You're going to see that word a lot. That number is 150,000. That's just the easiest way to remember that. So on the second type of procurement, if you have a purchase between $3,000 and $149,999, you're required to obtain quotes. And it says here no cost analysis or cost price analysis is required. And it took me a while to realize what that was, and I think we're all doing that anyway. When you go out and you get an estimate of what something's going to be, most generally, hopefully you're all doing that. I think, it may say that you don't, but a lot of these, it stipulates whether you're required to do that or not. Again, I think units are doing it, and they don't realize they're actually complying with the cost price analysis. Sealed bids, sealed proposals. This is for construction. It requires formal advertising. You need 2 or more bidders. And there's a public opening of bids. And this is what, again, construction, this is what they're expecting to see, the sealed bid process. It talks about that it's supposed to be a firm fixed price contract, and that just means basically that it's all based on price and you're going to award to the lowest bidder, just like you've always done before. Any and all bids may be rejected if there's sound reason. Okay, so we're still under competition. The last one's competitive on this screen. Competitive proposals. This is used when sealed bids are not appropriate, but they require advertising. You have to have a written method for conducting how you evaluate. You have to obtain it from an adequate number of sources. They're giving you these vague terms, not like 12, but I don't know how you define that, but obviously it's going to be more than 2 or so. Normally has more than one source submitting an offer. The interesting thing about competitive proposals, and I even read it last night, the only service that you can use competitive proposal, which is not sealed bids, is for architectural and engineering. So if you get to that point where you are going to, will be needing those services, you definitely need to look at this section. Because the way I understand it, those would be the only services that would fall under that would not require sealed bids. It basically says price is not used as a selection factor because they're based on the qualifications. So that's the one exception. The last procurement method is basically, this is non-competitive, but this is sole source. In other words, there's only one single source I can get this, that I can obtain this, whatever it is, your equipment. Or there's a public emergency, and we can't delay. We don't have time to generate competition. You may also get you can get the awarding agency can actually authorize you to make a purchase without competing. And after you solicit a number of sources, if they seem inadequate, then you can go with a sole source. So this is probably one of the most important screens, I think. This summarizes what I just talked about, procurement method. Remember, the first one's the micro. It's under $3,000, no quotes. But you have to make sure that you're distributing it to any of those suppliers who are qualified. 320B, they consider that small purchases as well. That's from $3,000 to really $149,499. You need quotes. You don't have to do a cost or price analysis. Hopefully, they're probably doing that anyway, calling around. You've got an idea of how much something is going to be. The simplified acquisition threshold, that's for the construction. If they're over $150,000, you need sealed bids. That price is a major factor. We talked about the lowest and best bid. Remember, and they kept repeating this, construction. This is for construction, sealed bids. Second to the last column, this is 320D. This is the non-construction. And finally, the sole source, that's a unique situation. Either a public emergency, you have no competition, or you've got authorized but from the agency. So this screen here, I think, will help tremendously in the procurement methods that you will be basing your decision on. $200.321 just talks about small and minority businesses and how you have to make sure that they're on your solicitation list, and you divide up projects. If you do divide those up, that those individuals have an opportunity to bid. Procurement of recovered materials, that's $200.322. Again, remember, this is just going to be a guide for you. This has every standard for procurement. And if you like some interesting reading material, it will definitely put you to sleep. I'm not going to go into this too much, but every procurement, if it's in excess of the simplified acquisition threshold, you have to have a cost price analysis. You're doing that. for the most part. And the method and the degree of the cost analysis you do, it depends on the situation. They don't give guidelines on how you're supposed to do a cost analysis. They just, it's totally how detailed you want to get. But evidently, you will have to show evidence that you have made that analysis. Procurement review. This could, again, involve you. This is an asterisk. You must make available upon request specs or proposed procurements. A lot of times these reviews will take place prior to procurement. And some of the situations they actually, examples they gave is if, say, there was a procurement process that you failed to comply with the procurement standards. A procurement is expected to exceed that $150,000, but you did it without competition. And it was construction. So, and I'm sure all of you want to do this. If you'd like them to come in and review just to see if you're doing a good job, they will be more than happy to do that. So, I laughed at that one. Bonding requirements. We're up to 200.325. Bonding may be required for construction. So, if you've got a construction project, right here, I'm detailing out the minimum requirements. I'm not going to read those, but talks about a performance bond, a payment bond. And finally, 200.326. Basically saying you have to follow the contract provisions. And I've detailed those out. It actually references you to the Appendix 2, Part 200. This is a lot of what's in there. This is probably beyond your scope, but just to let you know, this is what needs to be in those contracts. So I realize a lot of this is more than you needed to know. Quick reference, hand guide to pull, and at least you can see. And for some reason, my last slide's not on here. But I did, there is a website, and we'll put it back out, that you go to this website, you have access to the Code of Federal Regulations, the most current changes. So we'll put that on the website because that would be very beneficial. And unfortunately, I didn't realize this website existed until late last week. So, okay. So if you want a quick summary of some things to put in your procurement policy, this is not all inclusive. These are just the items that I ran across as I was looking through the materials. Okay, number one, you have to have your local and state laws in there that you're going to comply with those. We don't tell you how detailed to get. You may say, I'm going to comply with IC 522, and we've seen them where they detail those out. Either way, those need to be in your policy. Any public purchase, public works, obviously, any local policies you may have. Your procurement policy, you want to note what your contract files, what kind of document history you want to be maintained. Do you want the contracts? Do you want all the invoices? Do you want a bid sheet? Those are the type of things you would address in your policy. Talking about a cost analysis. We all do that, but probably should put that in your procurement policy. You need to go make some type of an estimate. We talked about description of your technical requirements, like if you're going to hire the architectural, some of the, and I didn't quite understand this, but they use technical requirements for services. Conflict of interest, that's a biggie. And a lot of the verbiage you can take right from these regulations. Gratuities aren't acceptable. I would include that. That's part of the written procedures. In addition, if they decide they want to allow some purchases, again, that should be disclosed in there for those low dollar amounts. You also need to disclose anyone who violates the conflict of interest, what the disciplinary action is going to be. Verification that procurement provides full and open competition. That is a big one, open competition. How you're going to react or obtain suspension and debarment. What happens when you find someone is suspended? Actually, going through those procedures, there are 3 different methods on how you can check those. So those are some of the items that you would put in there, how you would want those checked. Segregation of duties, who does what? You've heard that 100 times, internal control. Again, this is not all inclusive, but this would get you a great start. So what I decided to do, I went back and talked to our quality control department, and I want to know exactly, just to convey to you, what we're testing when we go out. What are we looking at? Show me the guidelines. So I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about what we are doing, to give you a little heads up. We're going to come in and identify your controls. Remember I talked about that before? I'm going to identify your controls, and then I'm going to test your controls on procurement. Do you have a procurement manual available to your employees? Is there oversight on your board? Are procedures in place to identify conflict of interest statements? So I'm going to go through. We're going to document those things, and one of the big things we're going to use are the written guidelines that you have. Now we're going to test those controls. Okay, did you give that manual to everyone who's involved? We may go down to the highway department. Hey, do you have this manual? So those controls we just talked about, make sure you implement those. You don't just write them, because that's what we're using. Here are your controls. We're going to go out and we're going to test those controls. And when I ended up looking at the compliance testing, remember we talked about test of controls and compliance testing. We're heavily looking at suspension and debarment. I've given some CFR Code of Federal Regulations in your handout, some regulations where you can go and you can look a little bit more on suspension and debarment. I wanted to, just to let you know, like I said, I know this one is in the handout. There are 3 manners that they have in the regulations for you to check on suspension and debarment: checking the SAM exclusions, collecting a certification from that person, or adding a clause or condition to the covered transaction for that person. So that's just some additional information. Again, I stress that you look at the that section that would apply to you. The last thing that I did, I was curious to what we have been writing up lately, since we are actually in the process of testing procurement, and it all, basically, the 3 that I found, all related to no written policy. The other thing I want to stress is you basically need to have written guidelines for state and local and federal, because the small purchasing policy requires that you have your own policy for disbursements under, how much? I forget, 25,000? I had it written down. So let's say that your policy says, okay, anything with a value of 5,000 or more, we're going to require this. But remember, the micro purchase amount's 3,000. So there are units that are actually making one policy for both state and federal disbursements, procurement. Are we confused on that? Do you understand what I'm saying? You can have 2. You have to have your small purchasing policy, and then the federal guidelines, you have to have all this. But you can make one that would apply to both federal and local and state. So if your small purchasing policy originally said 5,000 and your plan is to combine these, your new threshold is now 3,000. But it makes it a lot simpler when you're trying to determine what applies and what does not. Either is fine, but I wanted to throw that out because I know there's some confusion on intermingling those. Okay? Are there any questions? I know this wasn't a hot topic. Yes? The guy.
Commissioner, it's a county policy, so it would be Board of Commissioners. Yes,
Hang on a second.
thank you.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Will you repeat that?
I will. I said, who has the authority to sign off on this? And what Lori said was the Board of Commissioners. This whole thing would be good to have in the policy itself.
Yeah.
So, were we required to have one last year? When did this come into
This
effect?
actually, the timing is perfect. The deadline on these procurement procedures are actually December 26, 2017 for audits after. So
Okay.
be a good time to get it done, let's put it that way.
Before we get there.
Yes.
Anyone else have questions?
Again, it's a lot of information, but once I got into it, I just felt like, it was a good tool just to detail out everything, and some of your department heads use, your commissioners. When you write your guidelines, I would strongly suggest you go to those regulations and use those same terminology. So,
And I guess since we're not policymakers ourselves as auditors, is this in conjunction with your commissioners, or are we taking this back as a strong want from the auditors for the commissioners to impose it?
well, it's a strong want from the federal government. That's the way I would put it. That the commissioners do. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.